Tommy did not want to close his eyes. The room was dark except for the thin stripe of yellow beneath his bedroom door. Beyond it, the house seemed to wait in a quiet that felt different from other nights. He could hear the furnace come on somewhere below, then the soft ticking that followed as the vents warmed. After that, there was only stillness. He lay beneath his blanket, staring into the dark. Every now and then, he turned his head toward the window, where the glass had gone black and cold. On the chair by the wall were the clothes his mother had told him to set out for morning. He knew he was supposed to be asleep. His mother had come in not long ago and pulled the blanket up near his shoulders. She had told him, smiling, that Christmas would arrive whether he was awake or asleep. Tommy had nodded and shut his eyes while she stood in the doorway. The second her footsteps faded down the hall, he had opened them again. Morning felt too large to sleep through. The whole week had been like that. School had turned soft at the edges. On the last afternoon before vacation, Danny had leaned over and whispered about a boy on his street whose cousin had a Nintendo. He said there was a game with a man in red overalls who ran through bright places full of pipes and mushrooms. Tommy had tried not to show how much that stayed with him, but it had. Nintendo. He had seen it only in pieces before. A picture in a flyer, a box high on a shelf in a store, a few bright seconds in a television commercial. Those glimpses had only made it seem less real. Later, when the lamps were switched off and only the tree remained lit in the corner, the feeling in the house grew stronger. Tommy had stood in the hallway before bed and looked toward that room as long as he could without being told to move along. The presence beneath the tree had looked different tonight. Closer somehow. More real. One of them had stayed in his mind. It was wrapped in paper, covered with small snowmen in blue scarves. Not the biggest box under the tree, but close. It had square corners and a shape that seemed important. Tommy had tried not to guess too hard. Still, his thoughts kept returning to it. He turned onto his side and listened. A floorboard somewhere down the hall gave a quiet creak and settled. Pipes clicked faintly inside the wall. Wind moved against the house with a dry whisper and went on. He imagined the living room below him as clearly as if he were standing there. The tree lights glowing without any sound at all, the presents waiting in careful piles, the dark television screen reflecting tiny red and green points of light. That was part of the magic. At night on Christmas Eve, the room below belonged to another kind of world. The air downstairs smelled faintly of pine, warm dust from the bulbs, and the last trace of cookies from the kitchen. Tommy shut his eyes and tried to let himself drift. For a few moments he almost managed it. The blanket felt heavy and safe. His breathing slowed, then a thought came so suddenly that his eyes opened again. What if he woke before everyone else? The idea sent a rush through him. He pictured slipping from bed in the dark, opening his door carefully, and walking down the hallway in his socks. He could see the first glimpse of the tree from halfway down the stairs, shining in the dim living room while the rest of the house was still asleep. He smiled before he could help it. On the shelf near his bed sat a red truck with one bent wheel, a plastic dinosaur with paint rubbed off its back, and a paperback book whose corners had gone soft. All of them belonged to other days. Tomorrow, he felt, would place something new among them, even if he still did not know exactly what. He listened again for voices downstairs, but there were none now. The house had settled more deeply, as if at last it had decided to sleep. Tomorrow there would be wrapping paper tearing open in his hands. There would be winter light at the windows and the tree still glowing though morning had come. Whatever waited beneath it would wait a few hours more. That waiting, he realized, was part of Christmas too. The thought quieted something in him. He turned once more toward the window and pulled the blanket closer under his chin. The furnace breathed again. A bare branch tapped lightly somewhere outside. At last his eyes began to grow heavy. The room did not disappear all at once. It loosened slowly as though the darkness were drifting in around him, and with the tree downstairs still glowing in the dark and Christmas morning drawing nearer with every passing minute, Tommy finally let himself sink towards sleep, carrying one last hope with him, that when he opened his eyes again, it would be Christmas and the house would still be quiet enough for him to hear it begin. Tommy woke without knowing at first why he was awake. The room was still dark. For a few slow seconds he lay motionless beneath the blanket, feeling the warmth around him and listening to the quiet that filled every corner. It was a deeper quiet than the one that came during the night, softer somehow, as if the house were holding its breath. Then he remembered. Christmas. The word seemed to brighten the darkness at once. His eyes opened fully. He turned his head toward the window. The glass was no longer black, though it was not yet morning either. A pale winter grey had begun to gather there. The shape of the dresser stood clearer now. The chair by the wall had become a chair again, instead of a shadow. His clothes were still folded where he had left them. For a moment, Tommy stayed exactly where he was, almost afraid to move, as though Christmas morning might be something delicate that could be disturbed if he rose too quickly. He listened. No voices, no footsteps in the hallway, no clatter from the kitchen, only the faint hum from the vent near the floor and, somewhere farther away, the old refrigerator downstairs making its steady sound in the dark. His parents were still asleep. The whole house, except for him, seemed wrapped in one last layer of night. A small thrill moved through him. He had done it. He had woken before everyone else. Tommy pushed the blanket down just enough to slip one arm free, then another. The air outside the bed was cold enough to make him pull in a quiet breath. He sat up slowly. The mattress gave a soft creak beneath him, loud in the still room, and he froze for a second, listening again. Nothing. No doors opening, no voice calling his name. He swung his legs over the edge and placed his feet on the floor. The cold travelled up through his socks at once. It was the sharp, honest cold of winter mornings. He stood carefully and looked once more toward the door. Beneath it there was no yellow stripe now. The hole upstairs must still be dim. He dressed by feel more than sight, moving slowly so the hangers would not rattle. Shirt first, then jeans. He had to sit on the edge of the bed to pull them on without losing his balance. The room felt full of tiny sounds. The whisper of fabric, the small click of a button, the soft brush of his sleeve against the wall. When he was ready, he stood near the door with one hand on the knob. This was the moment he had imagined before falling asleep. He turned it carefully. The latch gave with a quiet metallic sound, and the door opened a few inches. The hall beyond was dim and bluish with early light. At the far end, the bathroom door stood closed. His parents' room was dark. The air outside his room felt cooler, carrying the faint smell of the house before morning truly began. Tommy stepped into the hall. He moved lightly, placing each foot with care. Halfway to the stairs, he paused and looked back, as though to make sure his room was still there behind him, with its warm bed and dim corners and the remains of night inside it. Then he turned and kept going. The top of the staircase waited in shadow. He rested one hand on the banister and looked down. The lower floor was darker than the hall above, but at the bottom of the stairs, through the doorway to the living room, something glowed. The tree. He could not yet see all of it, only the lower branches and a scatter of coloured points in the dark. Red, green, gold, blue. Tommy stayed where he was for a few seconds, his hand wrapped around the banister, simply looking. This was what he had hoped for. Not the tearing of paper yet, not voices. Not breakfast smells or footsteps or laughter, just this first moment, the house still asleep, the morning not fully begun, the tree shining as though it had been waiting only for him. He started down. Each step gave the smallest complaint beneath his weight. He knew which ones made more noise and avoided them without having to think. Halfway down the stairs he could see into the living room more clearly. The dark rectangle of the television sat beside the tree, catching small points of colour in its glass. Beneath the branches, the presents were gathered in quiet shapes, some bright, some plain, their ribbons dull in the half-light. At the bottom of the stairs he stopped again. The air here held the deep, familiar smell of pine and the faint warm scent of the tree lights. Somewhere beyond the living room, the kitchen waited in darkness. The house had not yet become a Christmas house in motion. It was still only a sleeping house with Christmas inside it. Tommy stood with his arms close to his sides, hardly daring to breathe too deeply, and looked toward the tree as the first pale morning of Christmas gathered at the windows. Tommy did not step fully into the living room at first. He stood near the doorway with one hand against the frame, as if the room beyond required quiet permission. The tree lights shone steadily in the dimness. The couch was only a darker shape along the wall. The armchair near the lamp looked still. Beyond all of it, beneath the tree, the presents waited. The sight of them gave Tommy the strange feeling that the room was fuller than it had been the night before. It was only that everything seemed closer now. Christmas was no longer somewhere ahead of him. It was here, standing quietly in the half-dark, wrapped in paper and ribbon and tree light. He took a few careful steps onto the carpet. Even through his socks, he could feel the difference between the hallway floor and the living room rug. The carpet was warmer, thicker, with that deep softness that made his steps almost soundless. He moved slowly, his eyes fixed on the cluster of presents beneath the lowest branches. A few were small and square, tucked near the trunk. One was long and narrow. And there, not far from the centre, was the box he had noticed the night before. The paper with the blue-scarved snowmen looked different in the dawn light. Last night it had seemed bright and secretive. Now it looked cool and crisp, the white spaces in the paper almost silver in the dim room. The bow on top had slipped a little to one side. Tommy noticed that one corner of the package was slightly pressed in, just enough to show that whatever was inside had real edges. He stopped a few feet away. He had the sudden feeling that if he went any closer, the moment would change. Someone would call from upstairs. Morning would become ordinary. So he stayed where he was and let himself look. The tree reached above him with its quiet, layered branches. Some of the ornaments were ones he saw every year and knew almost by heart. The round red glass ball with a thin scratch near the top, the little wooden soldier with faded paint, the silver icicles that always slid too far down the branches. Near the back hung the crooked paper angel he had made in school when he was younger. Its wings were bent, but his mother had never stopped putting it on the tree. The lights were the old kind that seemed warm rather than bright. They gave the room a hush of colour instead of filling it. Red pooled faintly on the carpet. Green touched the side of the television cabinet. Tommy turned his head toward the television. It sat in its usual place, silent and dark, its screen reflecting the tree in a softened scatter of coloured dots. He imagined what it would look like later when everyone was awake. Morning cartoons, maybe. The crackle of wrapping paper. But right now, the room belonged to this earlier hour, and he was alone inside it. He moved nearer to the tree at last and crouched down. From here, the presents seemed larger. The branches above him held the smell of pine and dust-warm bulbs. Tommy looked at the labels, though he had already promised himself he would not touch anything. His name appeared more than once in his mother's careful handwriting. Tommy. The letters alone were enough to send a small rush through him. There was something wonderful about seeing his name written there, attached to shapes he could only guess at. He looked from one gift to another and tried not to count, though of course he did. The snowman paper box had his name on it too. He did not reach for it. He kept his hands tucked close to himself. Still, he leaned in just enough to study it. The wrapping was neat but not perfect. Along one side, a fold rose slightly where the tape had not been pressed down all the way. The ribbon beneath the bow crossed the bottom in a straight line, then disappeared underneath. It was a serious-looking package, not soft, not light. It had the feeling of something that mattered. A floorboard upstairs gave a faint sound. Tommy lifted his head at once. He listened hard, but the house settled back into stillness. He stayed crouched for another moment, then slowly stood. The windows were beginning to change. They had been dark when he came downstairs, but now a thin wash of winter morning showed through the curtains. Not sunlight yet. Only that colourless early brightness that made edges clearer and shadows less deep. The tree lights still held their place against it, but the room was gradually becoming a room again instead of a secret. Tommy took one step back from the presents, then another. It seemed important somehow, not to be too close when the others came down. He did not want the spell of this quiet hour broken by being told gently to wait. Then, from somewhere above, came the sound of water running in the bathroom pipes. The house at last was beginning to wake. Tommy stood still and listened to the sound of water moving through the pipes. It was not a loud sound, only a brief rushing behind the walls, but it changed the feeling of the house at once. Until that moment, everything downstairs had seemed suspended, as if morning had paused on the edge of beginning. Now the pause was ending. Someone was awake upstairs. He looked once more toward the presents beneath the tree. The snowman paper box was still there, square and self-contained. Yet the room itself had changed, if only a little. Soon there would be footsteps overhead, doors opening, voices not yet fully awake. The private hour he had stepped into before dawn was slipping away. Tommy turned from the tree and moved toward the couch. The cushion dipped when he sat down, and the springs beneath gave a faint old creak. From there he could see the room, the tree by the window, the television in its cabinet, the coffee table with last night's Christmas cards still resting in one corner, and the hallway beyond, dim and empty. He folded his hands together and waited. Upstairs, a door opened and closed. Then came another set of footsteps, slower and softer, as if someone was still half asleep. Tommy pictured his mother tying her robe as she crossed the hall. He pictured his father blinking at the lamp beside the bed. The furnace came on again, sending a low breath through the vents. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed in its steady way, and after a moment, Tommy heard the soft click of a cupboard door from somewhere beyond. That sound pleased him. It meant the house was beginning to become itself again. Outside, dawn had come a little farther. The windows held a pale grey brightness now, enough to show the shape of the room without help from the lamps. The tree lights still mattered, though. They were no longer alone against darkness, yet they remained the heart of the room. Tommy leaned back into the corner of the couch. He let his eyes move around the room, gathering details that seemed sharper this morning than on any other day. A piece of silver tinsel lay curled on the carpet near the television stand. One of the cards on the table had slipped partly open, showing a printed church with snow on its roof. His father's slippers stood beside the armchair exactly where they had been left the night before. Then came the smell of coffee. It reached the living room in a slow drift, warm and slightly bitter, mixing with the scent of pine. Tommy always thought that Christmas morning had its own smell, one that never appeared the same way on other days. It was tree needles, coffee, the cold at the windows, and something from the kitchen that had not yet become breakfast. He heard his mother's voice then, low and gentle, though he could not make out the words. His father answered with a sound more than a sentence. Tommy smiled to himself. A moment later, his mother appeared at the hallway entrance. For a second, she simply stood there, one hand resting lightly against the wall, her robe tied, her hair not yet brushed into place. She saw him on the couch and smiled in the quiet, unsurprised way mothers sometimes smiled when they had expected something all along. "Well," she said softly, "you made it down before the sun." Tommy smiled back. "I woke up early. I can see that." She stepped into the living room and looked toward the tree. "Your father's getting coffee," she said. "He'll be down in a minute." Tommy nodded. He wanted to ask whether they could start now, but the words did not come. Something in the room kept him patient. His mother crossed to the lamp beside the couch and switched it on. A soft yellow circle spread into the room, mixing with the coloured lights of the tree. The living room became warmer at once. Footsteps sounded in the hall. His father came in carrying his mug, steam rising in a thin, pale ribbon. He looked tired in the gentle way of someone awake before he meant to be. But when he saw Tommy sitting there fully dressed, waiting as if he had been keeping watch over the tree itself, his face changed. "Well," he said, almost exactly as Tommy's mother had, "looks like somebody's been ready for a while." Tommy gave a small shrug because there was no use pretending otherwise. His father sat in the armchair and set the mug carefully on the table beside him. The coffee smell deepened in the room. For a little while none of them said much. That too felt right. The room held them there. Tommy on the couch, his mother near the lamp, his father in the chair, the tree glowing beside the dark television, the presents waiting under the branches with their ribbons neat and untouched. And in that brightening pause before anything was opened, Tommy felt the morning gather itself, ready to begin. Tommy did not know who moved first. Perhaps it was his mother, glancing toward the tree as though some quiet signal had finally arrived. Perhaps it was his father, setting his mug farther back on the table. Or perhaps it was only the feeling in the room itself, that soft pressure of Christmas morning reaching the point where waiting could not stay waiting any longer. His mother looked at him and smiled. "All right," she said, "go ahead." For a second, Tommy did not rise. It was as if the moment he had been moving towards since the night before had finally opened, and he had to step into it carefully. Then he stood from the couch and crossed the carpet toward the tree. Red and green light slid over his sleeves as he passed. He knelt among the presents. He reached first for a smaller package because it was nearest. The paper crackled beneath his fingers. He found the edge of the tape and began to pull it back. The sound of paper opening filled the room. Inside was a pair of thick winter gloves, soft and dark blue. He smiled and looked up. His mother told him to try them on later when they went outside. Another gift held a book with a glossy cover. Another, a pack of batteries his father lifted with a small laugh and said they would probably need sooner than Tommy thought. There was chocolate wrapped in gold foil and a little plastic case of toy soldiers. Each thing mattered because it had been waiting for him under the tree. Yet all the while, somewhere to his right, the snowman paper box remained unopened. Tommy tried not to hurry. He truly did. He set each gift beside him as carefully as he could. Still, his eyes kept returning to that square package with its blue-scarfed snowmen and slightly pressed corner. At last, his mother touched the top of it lightly with one finger. "That one next," she said. Tommy placed both hands on the box. It was heavier than he expected. Not so heavy that he struggled to lift it, but heavy enough to feel important, full of real parts and sharp edges. He drew it toward him and settled it in his lap. The paper was cool and smooth under his fingers. For a moment he simply held it. The room had grown very quiet. Tommy could hear the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. His father did not say anything. His mother did not urge him on. Tommy loosened the bow first. The ribbon slid free with a soft whisper and fell away in a curling line. Then he found the taped seam and pulled. The paper opened along one side, a fold bent back, then another. The snowman vanished as the wrapping loosened around the corners. He stopped. There, beneath the torn paper, was a patch of box unlike any he had ever held before, deep grey, with a sharp red stripe and lettering so clean it seemed to belong to something from another world. Tommy pulled more of the paper away. A picture emerged. A machine, rectangular and shining. A controller in a hand. Bold words across the front. Nintendo Entertainment System. He stared at the box without moving. The words were there, plain and real, not imagined, not guessed at from a distance beneath the tree. Right there in his lap, with torn paper falling around it onto the carpet. His father let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Well," he said gently, "looks like Santa managed." Tommy heard him, but only from far away. He was still looking at the front of the box. The colours seemed rich in the morning light. The printed picture of the console looked serious and important, not like a toy in the ordinary sense, but like a machine meant to do something marvellous. Along the side, smaller pictures showed bright scenes from games. Tommy recognised one at once. Mario, mid-step in a world of blue sky and brick. His fingers tightened around the edges. "You can open it," his mother said softly. Tommy looked up at her then, almost to make sure she meant now. But her face told him already. His father was smiling too, one hand around his coffee mug, his eyes on Tommy rather than the box. Tommy lowered the package carefully to the carpet. The torn wrapping paper lay around him like drifts of thin snow. For one brief second he looked not at the box but at the television beside the tree, its dark screen catching points of coloured light. Then he looked back at the words again. Nintendo Entertainment System. It seemed to gather the whole morning into itself. The room, the tree, the pale winter daylight at the curtains, his parents nearby, the waiting of the night before. All of it now pointed toward this impossible fact resting on the carpet before him. Tommy placed his hand flat against the top of the box, and only then did the wonder of it begin to rise inside him, slow and deep, like something too large to fit all at once into words. Tommy did not open the box all at once. For a few seconds he only sat there with one hand resting on the lid, feeling the smooth cardboard beneath his palm. Torn wrapping paper lay across the carpet at his knees. The tree lights touched the red stripe on the box with shifting flecks of colour. Even now that it was his, part of him did not want to move too quickly. He had wanted this moment for so long that now it had come. He needed a little time just to remain inside it. His father leaned forward in the armchair and said softly, "Go on." Tommy slipped his fingers beneath the side flap. The cardboard gave with a firm little sound. He lifted the lid carefully. Beneath it was another layer of packaging, neat and close-fitting, with folded inserts holding everything in place. The sight of it made the gift feel even more serious. It was not simply one thing in a box. It was a whole arrangement. He bent closer. There was the console itself first, wrapped in clear plastic that caught the tree lights in faint glimmers. Even through the wrapping, it looked heavy and exact, all straight lines and dark edges. It did not resemble the toys around him. It looked like a machine meant to be connected, switched on, made ready. Beside it lay the controllers, each in its own place, their cords folded tightly. Tommy stared at them with awe. The black direction pad, the red buttons, the clean grey shape of each one. All of it seemed simple and important at the same time. He lifted one out first. The plastic crackled softly in the quiet room. When he slid the controller free, it felt cool and new in his hands. The buttons did not wobble. The cord was smooth and neatly wound. He turned it over, studying the back and edges. He had held game controllers before at other people's houses, but this one was different because it belonged to no one else yet. It had no fingerprints on it. It seemed to carry the untouched feeling of Christmas morning itself. His mother came a little closer and looked down into the box. "Everything has a place," she said. Tommy nodded. He set the controller gently on the carpet beside him and reached in again. The second controller lay beneath a folded instruction booklet. He lifted the booklet next. The paper smelled faintly of fresh ink. Inside, the pages were bright and stiff, crowded with diagrams and careful drawings. There were pictures of the console, arrows pointing to buttons and flaps, little blocks of writing that promised explanations for a world he had not yet entered. He turned the pages slowly. There were numbered steps, pictures of cartridges being pushed into place, cords running to the television, a power button pressed down. This was not just a gift to be opened, it was something to be assembled. Beneath the booklet were cables, wrapped and tied. Tommy lifted one and let part of it fall gently into his lap. It seemed impossibly long, with metal ends and black wires that curled back on themselves. He did not fully understand where each one would go, but he knew his father would. The mystery did not frighten him. It deepened the feeling that the morning was leading somewhere. Then, tucked beside the console, he saw the game. For a moment, he only looked. The cartridge sat inside a paper sleeve printed with bright colours, and beside it lay another booklet, thinner than the first. Tommy knew what it must be before he touched it. He drew it out with both hands. On the front, against a blue sky, Mario appeared in mid-step. One gloved hand raised, his world made of clean blocks and impossible brightness. Super Mario Bros. The letters alone seemed alive. Tommy's breath caught a little in his chest. He had seen pictures before, in stores, in magazines, in folded advertisements from the weekend paper. But seeing the game here, inside the same box as the console, with the cartridge weighty and real in his hands, was different. It felt less like looking at a promise and more like standing at the edge of something that was about to begin. His father rose from the chair then and came over to kneel beside the tree. "Well," he said, smiling into the box, "I suppose the next job is getting all this onto the TV." Tommy glanced from the cartridge in his hand to the dark screen across the room. The television still reflected the tree lights. He looked back down at the open box, at the console in its plastic, the controllers, the cords, the booklets, and the cartridge resting in his lap. The new smell of plastic and paper had joined the sense of pine and coffee in the room. He understood, in that moment, that opening the gift had only been the first part. The real wonder was still ahead, folded carefully inside wires, buttons, and one small cartridge that seemed to contain an entire world. Tommy helped carry everything to the television. His father took the console itself, one hand steady beneath the base as though it was something more delicate than it looked. Tommy followed with the controllers and the cartridge sleeve pressed carefully against his chest. His mother gathered the loose wrapping paper from the carpet behind them, smoothing it into a rustling pile, while the tree lights continued to glow in the corner. The television sat in its cabinet near the wall. Tommy had looked at that television almost every day of his life. He knew the little mark on the wood near the dial, the faint scratch at one corner of the screen, the way the picture sometimes took a second to settle after being switched on. Yet this morning it seemed different to him, because it was about to become the doorway for something new. His father knelt in front of it and set the console on the carpet. Let's see what we've got here, he said. Tommy lowered himself beside him. Up close, the back of the television looked more complicated than it ever did from the couch. There were cords already there, a fine coat of dust along the baseboard, and the faint dry smell that old electronics seemed always to have. His father reached behind the cabinet and began tracing one cable at a time. The instruction manual lay open on the floor between them. Tommy watched the pictures first, then the words beneath them. Each step seemed simple in the drawings and more mysterious in real life. There was the game unit, the switch box, the cord to the wall, the controller ports in front. His father gave a thoughtful sound. "Channel 3, he said. The console was unwrapped now. Tommy could not stop glancing at the flap where the cartridge would go. It remained closed for now, holding its secret inside. His father handed him one of the cords. Can you keep that from tangling itself?" Tommy took it with both hands as if accepting an important assignment. The wire was cooler than he expected, and it held the shape of being wound in the box. He gently worked it straighter while his father connected one end of the switch box and reached again behind the television. For a while the work went on quietly. There were small sounds, the soft scrape of the console shifting on the carpet, the light click of a metal end finding its place, the whisper of manual pages being turned. Tommy's mother came in once from the kitchen and set a plate of toast on the coffee table along with another cup of coffee for his father. The smell drifted through the room and settled among the pine scent from the tree and the new plastic smell still rising from the Nintendo pieces on the rug. Christmas had begun in silence and dim tree light. Then it had become paper opening, voices and surprise. Now it had narrowed into this small patch of carpet in front of the television, where the whole day seemed to lean forward with them. It felt to Tommy that if every wire was placed correctly, then something more than a machine would happen. A world would appear. His father sat back on his heels for a moment and studied the manual again. "These things always look easier in the pictures," he said. Tommy smiled, though his own stomach tightened a little. He did not want anything to go wrong. What if the television would not take it? What if the picture came on wrong, all snow and lines and no game at all? His father must have sensed something in him because he reached over and touched Tommy lightly on the shoulder. "We'll get it," he said. "Don't worry." The reassurance settled him. He looked again at the console. The controller ports were empty, waiting. He plugged one controller in when his father told him where it went, pressing firmly enough until it seated with a satisfying feel. At last, the last cable was in place. His father rose, carrying the television's small selector switch between his fingers, and clicked it to the proper side. Then he reached down to lift the Nintendo onto the shelf beneath the screen. It fit there as if the space had been waiting for it all along. Tommy stood too, holding the Mario cartridge in its sleeve. The room seemed still. His father looked at him and smiled. "All right," he said. "I think we're ready for the game." Tommy looked down at the cartridge in his hands. It was heavier than it seemed, dense in a way that made him respect it. The label shone bright and clean. Mario was still there against the blue sky, forever in mid-step, waiting for the moment when his printed world would become a moving one. Tommy slid the cartridge gently from its sleeve and held it up for a second in the Christmas morning light. Then he turned toward the console, ready at last for the part he had been imagining since the box first opened. Tommy held the cartridge with both hands. It was not large, yet it carried a strange kind of weight. The grey plastic shell was smooth and cool. The label on the front looked almost too bright for the quiet room, its blue sky and clean colours promising something Tommy could not yet imagine. His father tapped the top flap of the console. "Go ahead," he said. Tommy knelt on the carpet in front of the television again. The Nintendo sat beneath the screen in its new place. He lifted the front flap. It opened with a neat little click, revealing the slot inside. The empty space looked simple, but not ordinary. It was waiting. Tommy brought the cartridge closer. For 1 second he hesitated, afraid of doing it wrong. He had seen the pictures in the manual, but still he wanted this first motion to be perfect. The room had gone quiet around him. His father leaned forward slightly. "Label facing up." Tommy nodded. He slid the cartridge into the slot. It moved in firmly, guided by something hidden inside the machine. When it reached the end, he pressed it down. There was a gentle mechanical give, then a soft settling sound as it locked into place. Tommy stared at it. That was it. The game was in the machine. Super Mario Bros. Now existed inside the Nintendo itself, waiting behind the dark glass of the television. His father reached for the TV dial. The set clicked on with a brief crackle, and the screen came alive in a pale rush of grey. For a moment it was only static, a field of dancing snow. Tommy's stomach tightened. Then his father turned the dial to channel 3. The screen changed. The snow vanished. A dark blankness came over the glass for the briefest beat. "Now," his father said, and pressed the power button on the Nintendo. A small red light appeared on the front of the console. Tommy did not know why that light moved him so much, but it did. It was tiny and steady and absolutely certain. Something had started. The screen flickered once, then colour burst into the room. It was not the soft Christmas colour of the tree, nor the pale winter light at the curtains. This was a brighter world altogether. Blue sky, clean letters, simple shapes arranged with a confidence Tommy had never seen on his television before. The title appeared there on the screen, plain and miraculous at once. Super Mario Bros. Tommy felt his breath leave him in a quiet rush. The picture was sharper than he expected. The colours seemed to stand on the screen instead of inside it. Music came from the television speaker, bright and immediate, filling the room with a sound that felt playful and important. Tommy had heard bits of game music before in stores and at other houses, but here in his own living room on Christmas morning, it seemed larger. It belonged here now. His mother had come back from the kitchen without his noticing. She stood near the couch, dish towel still in one hand, smiling at the television as if she too had been waiting for the world inside it to appear. "Well," she said softly, "look at that." Tommy could only stare. The title screen held steady. Mario stood there in bright colour. Words and numbers rested in neat rows. Everything about it felt clean and full of possibility. The dark television that had reflected tree lights before dawn was gone. In its place was an opening. His father handed him the controller. The cord trailed down across Tommy's knees. He took the controller almost reverently. It no longer felt like a new object, lifted from a box. It felt connected now, joined to the glowing world in front of him. His thumbs found the buttons without being told where to rest. For a moment he did not press anything. The music continued. The title remained. The room seemed to arrange itself around that screen. The couch and chairs, the tree in the corner, the coffee on the table, the opened box and manuals still on the carpet behind them. Christmas morning had narrowed into one bright rectangle of light and sound, and everything else had become its quiet witness. His father sat back in the armchair again. His mother moved to the couch, but kept her eyes on the television. Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, the controller in his hands, and let the first astonishment settle inside him. He had imagined the Nintendo before this morning. He had imagined the box, the controllers, the game, but he had not imagined this exact feeling. Tommy looked down at the red A button beneath his thumb, then back up at Mario on the screen. Outside, Christmas morning was growing brighter. Inside, the room held the glow of the tree and the new light of the television together. At last, Tommy pressed start, and the bright title screen gave way as though a door he had only discovered had quietly begun to open. Tommy pressed go. Start with a care that almost felt too gentle for the button beneath his thumb. The title vanished. For a breath of time, the screen went dark. Then the world appeared. Blue sky, Brown ground, green hills in the distance. A little figure stood at the far left, red and brown and waiting. Tommy knew it was Mario, of course. He had seen him on the box. But on the screen, Mario did not look printed. He looked ready. Tommy sat forward without meaning to. The controller was warm in his hands now. He pressed the direction pad and Mario moved. It was only a few steps to the right, yet something inside Tommy changed with it. The world did not stay still while he watched it. It answered him. The ground passed beneath Mario's feet. A bright green pipe slid into view. Tommy let out a quiet breath that was almost a laugh. Watching from the chair, smiled into his coffee. His mother had settled onto the couch, understanding that this moment mattered. Mario jumped. Tommy had not meant for him to do it. His thumb had brushed the button too soon, and the little figure lifted into the air, then came down again with a neat, certain drop. Even that mistake felt wonderful. He pressed again, this time on purpose. Mario leapt over the pipe and landed. Then a brown creature came onto the screen from the right, walking toward him. Tommy had only enough time to think that it looked almost harmless before Mario ran directly into it and the music stopped. The screen changed. A few bright letters appeared against black. Game over. For 1 second, no one said anything. Then his father gave the smallest chuckle, not unkind, and Tommy felt his own face break into a smile. That didn't last long, his mother said. Tommy laughed too, half embarrassed and half delighted. Somehow even losing felt interesting. It meant the world was real enough to push back. He pressed start again. This time he moved more carefully. Mario walked, then ran. Tommy watched each shape that entered from the right with such concentration that the room around him faded. The couch, the tree, the opened box behind him, all of it slipped softly to the edges while the television held him. He learned quickly. A jump could clear a pipe if he timed it right. The brown creatures could be landed on instead of touched. Blocks overhead were not just scenery. When Mario struck one from below, a coin sprang up with a bright sound that Tommy felt almost physically. His father leaned forward once. Can he go down there? Tommy barely heard him at first. A green pipe stood ahead. Mario stopped beside it. Tommy pressed down experimentally, but nothing happened. So he moved on. The game did not explain itself. It simply continued, offering one thing after another. Bricks, gaps, enemies, little triumphs, sudden mistakes. Tommy liked that. Then a mushroom came out of a block. Tommy stared as it slid along the top and dropped toward Mario. He did not know whether to avoid it or catch it. Before he could decide, Mario touched it and instantly grew. Tommy gasped. Mario was bigger now. His father said, "Oh, would you look at that?" And Tommy felt that deep thrill of discovering a rule only after it had already become true. He kept playing. Sometimes Mario jumped cleanly and Tommy felt almost graceful. Sometimes he misjudged by a fraction and lost what he had just gained. But the game never seemed to scold him. It simply began again, fresh and ready. After a while, his mother rose from the couch and went back toward the kitchen. Tommy heard cabinet doors, the clink of plates, the ordinary movement of Christmas morning continuing somewhere behind him. The smell of toast returned, then bacon. His father stood too and crossed to the tree to switch off the coloured lights now that daylight had fully come. But even after the bulbs went dark, the room did not lose its magic. Tommy hardly noticed the time passing. He began to feel the places in the level before he fully understood them. The first pipe, the staircase of blocks, the flagpole waiting at the far edge like a promise. Then, after many tries, Mario reached the castle. The flag dropped. The music changed. The little figure disappeared into the doorway, and for a second, Tommy simply sat there, holding the controller and staring as if he had somehow travelled the whole distance himself. His father, now standing behind the couch, said quietly, "You got there." Tommy turned and looked up at him with a grin that seemed too large for his face. Then he looked back at the screen, where another world was already waiting beyond the first. The morning stretched on around him, gentle and bright, and Tommy settled more deeply onto the carpet, knowing this was only the beginning. By late morning, the living room had changed. The secret stillness of dawn was gone, and in its place the day had opened fully. Light lay across the carpet in pale winter bands. Opened boxes and torn paper had been gathered into neater piles, though bits of ribbon still curled near the coffee table. From the kitchen came the warm smells of Christmas dinner, beginning long before dinner itself. Onions in butter, something sweet in the oven, coffee made again. Tommy still sat on the floor in front of the television. Over the course of the morning he had shifted from cross-legged to kneeling, then upright again whenever the game demanded all of him. But he had never gone far. The Nintendo glowed below the screen with its tiny red light, calm and steady as if it had always belonged there. Mario ran through worlds that felt brighter each time Tommy reached them. Sometimes he lost a life quickly and had to begin again. Sometimes he made it farther than he thought he could, only to miss a jump at the last moment and feel that small drop in his chest before the screen changed. Yet none of it discouraged him. The game kept offering him another chance, another clean beginning. His father had gone out for a little while after breakfast, promising to be back before noon. His mother moved between the kitchen and living room, carrying bowls, checking the oven, straightening things that did not need straightening. Every now and then she paused behind Tommy and watched the television for a few seconds. "Is that the same part?" she asked once. "No," Tommy said, without taking his eyes from the screen. "This one's different." At some point he became aware of the window again. Outside, the street had brightened into a clear Christmas afternoon. Snow remained in thin white patches along the lawns and driveways. The bare branches of the maple across the road stood dark against a pale sky. Then, in the middle of a jump, the doorbell rang. The sound startled him so much that Mario ran straight into an enemy and vanished from the screen. Tommy sat up at once. His mother called, "I've got it," from the kitchen, but Tommy had already turned. He heard footsteps in the hall, the opening of the front door, the brief rush of cold air. Then voices, his mother's first, warm and surprised, and another that Tommy recognized at once. "Danny." Tommy was on his feet before he knew he had stood. He set the controller down and went to the doorway between the living room and hall. Danny stood just inside the front door, shoulders drawn up inside his winter coat, his cheeks pink from the cold. He had a knitted hat in one hand and snow-wet shoes that he was trying not to bring too far onto the mat. Behind him, the open door showed a square of white daylight, and the porch rail dusted with old snow. "Hi," Danny said, then looked past Tommy into the living room. He stopped. For a second his whole face changed in the simplest way. His eyes widened, and the rest of him went still. Tommy did not need to ask what he was looking at. From where Danny stood, the television was visible first, bright with the Mario screen waiting patiently for the next life. Beneath it sat the Nintendo with its red power light on. One controller rested on the carpet, the other still lay beside the open box and manuals. Danny looked back at Tommy. "You got it," Tommy nodded. "This morning." Danny stepped out of his shoes so quickly that one tipped onto its side. He handed his hat to Tommy's mother without seeming to notice. She smiled and told him to come in. Danny answered, but his attention was already pulling toward the living room. Tommy led him in. The room looked different now through Danny's eyes, and because of that, different to Tommy too. The tree still stood in the corner, though the lights were off. The morning's presents had been opened and set aside. The television cast its bright Game World colours into the room, and the Nintendo below it seemed less like a surprise now than a fact, yet a marvellous one. Danny came to a stop near the couch and stared. "You've been playing all day?" "Pretty much." "Is it hard?" Tommy thought about it. "Sometimes." Tommy picked up the second controller from beside the box and held it out. Danny took it with both hands, almost carefully. The cord uncoiled across the carpet between them. Neither boy said anything for a moment. They only stood there in the bright Christmas room, side by side now, with the game waiting on the screen as if it had known another pair of hands would soon be needed. And in that quiet pause before either of them sat down, Tommy felt the day open a little wider, making room for something new. Danny did not sit right away. He stood holding the controller in both hands while Tommy lowered himself back onto the carpet in front of the television. The room had taken on the full Christmas brightness of early afternoon. From the kitchen came the faint clink of dishes and the low movement of Tommy's mother continuing with the day. On the screen, Mario waited where Tommy had left him, small against a bright stretch of blue sky. Danny looked from the screen to the controller in his hands and back again. "Which button jumps?" Tommy pointed. "That one. And this one makes him run." Danny nodded seriously. Then he sat beside Tommy, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The second controller cord curved over the rug between them. For now, they would only take turns. Tommy pressed start and handed over control. For a few seconds, Danny did nothing. Mario stood at the edge of the world, waiting. Then Danny pressed the direction pad, and Mario moved right. Danny let out a short laugh, more breath than sound. Tommy knew exactly the feeling. He had felt it that morning, sitting alone in front of the television while the rest of the house still arranged itself around Christmas. "Watch the first guy," Tommy said. "I know." But Danny did not yet. The little brown creature walked in from the right, and Mario ran straight into it. The music stopped. The screen changed. Danny turned to Tommy. "That was quick." Tommy laughed. "Yeah." Danny laughed too. Tommy had spent the morning learning the game in silence, but now each mistake had someone to belong to. Each surprise could be shared. Danny tried again. This time Tommy watched as closely as if he were playing himself. He leaned forward with every jump. When Danny cleared the first pipe, Tommy felt a small lift of triumph. When the mushroom appeared, both boys made the same surprise sound at once, even though Tommy had already seen it. Danny grabbed it and Mario grew. "Hey," Danny said. "Look at that!" "I know." Outside, a car rolled past on the street and was gone. In the kitchen, the oven door opened and shut. Tommy's mother came through once carrying a dish towel and paused behind the couch. "Well," she said, smiling at the sight of them side by side on the floor, "looks like I've lost the living room for the day." Neither boy answered right away. Danny was trying to judge the distance of a jump, and Tommy had lifted one hand unconsciously as if he could guide Mario across the gap by willing it. Danny made it over and landed safely. Tommy's mother laughed softly and went on. After a while, the turn-taking settled into its own rhythm. One boy played while the other watched with complete attention. Then the controller passed between them, back and forth, warm now from being held. Danny talked a little more than Tommy did, but not enough to break the quiet mood of the room. "Did you get past this?" "There's a pipe after that." "Wait, what does that do?" "Hit that one." Sometimes Tommy reached farther than Danny and felt a small flush of pride. Sometimes Danny made a jump Tommy had missed all morning, and Tommy felt the surprise of admiration. The game did not belong more to one of them than the other now. It had become something between them. At one point, Danny lost a life and handed the controller over with a solemn expression that lasted exactly 1 second before breaking into a grin. Tommy took it and said, "I'll get farther." Danny folded his arms. "You think so?" Tommy did not answer. He only leaned forward and guided Mario right. The world on the screen had begun to feel familiar in pieces. The first enemy, the first pipe, the blocks overhead, the hidden surprise of a mushroom. The flagpoles somewhere ahead like a thought of victory. And all the while, Christmas Day continued gently around them. A plate appeared on the coffee table with slices of bread and a little bowl of chips. Glasses of ginger ale were set down and forgotten for a long time afterward. Tommy's father returned home and stood in the doorway to the living room, smiling at the sight of the two boys on the floor, the Nintendo lit red beneath the television. Mario running through an impossible landscape. No one hurried them. No one asked for the room back. The light at the windows shifted almost without being noticed, becoming a little thinner, a little lower. The tree in the corner remained still and green. On the rug between Tommy and Danny, the controllers rested, traded hands, and were lifted again. By then, the game was no longer simply Tommy's Christmas gift. It had become the shape of the day itself, shared between them in bright jumps, narrow escapes, low laughter, and the close, easy silence that only came when two boys were entirely absorbed in the same new world. By the time the afternoon softened into evening, the living room had begun to grow quiet again. The light at the windows faded from pale winter silver to blue-grey. The sounds from the kitchen changed too. Earlier there had been dishes, footsteps, cabinet doors. Now there were only smaller sounds now and then, water running briefly, a drawer closing, Tommy's parents talking somewhere beyond the hall. On the television, Mario still moved through his bright world. Danny sat beside Tommy on the carpet. one knee drawn up, the controller resting lightly in his hands while he waited for his turn. They had been playing long enough that the first level no longer felt mysterious in the same way it had that morning. They both knew where the first enemy would appear. They both knew how to time the jump over the early pipe, yet knowing those things had not made the game smaller. It had only made them feel more deeply inside it. Tommy's father had switched on the lamp near the couch as daylight faded. Its yellow light spread over the room and mixed with the cooler glow of the screen. The Christmas tree stood dark now. Danny leaned closer as Tommy guided Mario over a gap. "You almost missed that," he said. Tommy smiled. Almost. The easy feeling between them had grown all afternoon. There had been quick victories, mistakes that made them groan together, and long stretches of close attention while one boy watched the other play. Then Tommy's mother came in and said Danny's mother had called. She would be coming by soon to pick him up. For a second, neither boy said anything. The day had become so full that Tommy had almost forgotten it would move toward night like any other day. Danny nodded, took his next turn, and played more carefully than before. Outside, a car passed once, headlights sliding over the front wall before vanishing. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked and stopped. At last, the doorbell rang. Danny set the controller down carefully on the carpet. For a moment, he did not stand. He looked at the television, at Mario waiting in place, then at the Nintendo beneath the screen with its steady red power light. "That's still so neat," he said quietly. Tommy looked at it too. "Yeah!" They went together to the front hall. Danny's shoes had dried by the door. He stepped into them, then pulled on his coat while cold air slipped in from outside. Danny's mother stood on the porch in the yellow porch light, smiling and apologizing for coming right around dinner. Tommy's mother told her it was no trouble. Danny turned back once before stepping out. "Can I come tomorrow?" Tommy nodded at once. "Yeah," Danny smiled. "Okay." Then he went down the walk beside his mother, moving through the early dark. The porch light fell across the steps, then the door closed, and the house became warm again. For a little while, Tommy stood in the hallway listening to the silence after someone leaves. It was not an empty silence, it held the trace of the afternoon inside it. When he went back into the living room, the television was still on. Mario waited on the screen. The lamp glowed, the tree stood in shadow near the window. On the coffee table were the remains of the day, a glass with melted ice, and the instruction manual with its pages bent from use. Tommy sat down on the carpet again. For a moment he did not pick up the controller. He only looked. This morning the room had belonged to tree lights and unopened gifts. Then it had become wrapping paper, surprise, wires, and the first impossible appearance of colour on the screen. By afternoon it had opened itself to Danny, and the game had become something shared. Now evening had come, quiet and certain. His father came in and stood behind the couch. "Big day," he said. Tommy nodded. His father looked at the television, then at the Nintendo. "You can play a little more before bed." Tommy nodded again. After his father went back toward the kitchen, Tommy reached forward and touched the controller with his fingertips. It was no longer cold and untouched the way it had been when he first lifted it from the box. It felt familiar already. He knew, without being able to explain how, that this Christmas would not fade the way ordinary days did. It was because the whole day had felt as if something had begun. Tommy picked up the controller at last. The television cast its steady light across his hands. Somewhere beyond the room, dishes touched lightly in the kitchen. Christmas Day was ending. But the feeling in Tommy did not feel like an ending. He pressed start, and with the room quiet around him, and Christmas night deepening beyond the windows, Tommy entered the bright little world again, carrying with him the first full memory of it, already beginning to glow.